Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
David Cameron has given a robust defence of his government's record. It follows accusations by Iain Duncan Smith, who resigned as Work and Pension Secretary last Friday, that the Conservative Party's policies, including its attitude to disabled people, risk dividing the country. In the last half an hour, the government has announced it will not be looking for further welfare cuts. Here's our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg.
Cleaning up the mess sounds simple. But this is more than a one-broom job. In the last 48 hours, numbers 10 and 11 have been accused of putting the rich before the poor, letting down the most vulnerable for votes. Now the rows behind the black door have brutally spilt out into public. David Cameron has never been under pressure like this. With his government in trouble, he was off to answer Iain Duncan Smith back.
Statement, the Prime Minister.
He chose not quite to kill Mr Duncan Smith with kindness, but showed some respect.
My right honourable friend contributed an enormous amount to the work of this government, and he can be proud of what he achieved.
But he rejected Iain Duncan Smith's most stinging attack, that the government's running out of compassion.
We will go on with our plans to rebuild sink estates, to help those with mental health conditions, to extend our troubled families programme, to reform our prisons and to tackle discrimination for those whose life chances suffer because of the colour of their skin. None of this would be possible if it wasn't for the actions of this government and the work of my right honourable friend the Chancellor in turning our economy around.
Trying to end with a flourish of his familiar promise.
We are a modern, compassionate, one-nation Conservative government.
Plenty of noise, but look at these backbenchers' body language. It doesn't transmit huge admiration. And the ditching of planned changes to disability benefits, less than a week since the budget, allowed Labour to brand the whole thing a mess.
The budget has a big hole in it. It's really up to the Prime Minister to persuade his great friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to either come here and explain how he's going to fill that hole, or perhaps he should consider his position.
But Jeremy Corbyn didn't even mention the man who's done most damage. Iain Duncan Smith was nowhere to be seen at his home today, nor anywhere in Westminster. In his absence, though, others were willing to keep the pressure up, praising the man who walked out.
May I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's generous comments about my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford, who is so widely respected on these benches.
The British people will not take kindly to the idea that we must cut benefits to vulnerable people in order to hand over every penny to the EU.
There was nothing like open revolt against the Prime Minister, but don't mistake that for overwhelming support.
Secretary Stephen Crabb.
But spare a thought for the new Work and Pension Secretary, Stephen Crabb, taking to his feet after a torrid few days, confirming that controversial changes to disability payments won't go ahead, and promising no extra cuts to welfare.
So I can also confirm that after discussing this issue over the weekend with my right honourable friends, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, we have no further plans to make welfare savings beyond the very substantial savings legislated for by Parliament 2 weeks ago, which we will now focus on implementing.
This leaves a question mark in the middle of the budget, the set of numbers that's meant to shape how the government spends and saves. But as David Cameron has found to his cost in the last couple of days, not everything is in his control. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So at the heart of this row lies the accusation that in last week's budget, the better off in society gained while the vulnerable were punished. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, is here with his assessment. Kamal.
Thanks very much, George. Now, two big issues rolled up to George Osborne's front door today. The major allegation from Iain Duncan Smith that the budget of last week simply wasn't fair, and that the ditching of disability payment savings could leave a large black hole in the Chancellor's budget calculations. So let's consider that fairness issue first. If we look at how people are affected by the tax changes last week, the This graph shows the difference between the richest and poorest households in the UK. The poorest 10% are no better off, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The wealthiest 10%, they will see their household income increase by £268 a year. Critics may say that is unfair, but the change should be seen in the context of the broader economy.
This budget did very little to the distribution of income, gave away a little bit of money to income taxpayers, essentially. If you look over the longer period, we've seen significant takeaways from people of working age on benefits, as promised by the Conservative manifesto, and very significant takeaways from people right at the top of the income distribution. People in the middle, remarkably unaffected.
Now, the Treasury looks at the issue of fairness differently. It analyses the total tax paid and the amount of public spending received. In 2010, the richest fifth of all households paid 49% of all taxes, whereas the poorest fifth paid around 6% of all taxes. By 2020, the proportion of tax paid by the richest fifth will have risen to 52%. For the poorest fifth, it stayed the same at around 6%. The Treasury says that shows the cuts have been handled fairly. Finally, let's look at that issue of the dreaded fiscal black hole that has been talked about today. Delaying the personal independence payment reforms for disabled people could cost the government around £1.3 billion by 2020. That number sounds large, but consider by then the government will be spending a total of £810 billion a year on public services, so £1.3 billion is relatively small change. It could easily be paid for by better economic growth or higher tax receipts. And we won't know about that until the autumn statement towards the end of this year, when my Treasury sources tell me any new areas for cuts, if they're needed, will be made clear. George.
Kamal, thanks very much. Well, let's speak to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who's at Westminster now. Laura, that commitment on welfare savings made, what, in the last half hour or so, how significant is that?
Well, George, I think it's a big promise. You know, in the last couple of days, the Conservative Party have been having a dreadful time. One minister described it to me as if they'd all been on a kamikaze mission. But that announcement from the brand new Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Stephen Crabb, doesn't just mean that those controversial changes to payments for disabled people have been junked. It also means, as he said, that there will be no new welfare cuts through the course of this Parliament, right up until 2020. Now, of course, for many people right around the country, there have already been very significant benefit cuts. Billions have come out of that budget, and we should not forget that fact. But this is a big promise to make at a time when money is tight and when the government is publicly very committed to hitting their targets to get rid of the deficit. So making a big promise like this suggests either lots of money is going to have to be saved from elsewhere, or the government might have to forget about their targets, or they're just praying that the economy picks up and gets much better and better, and suddenly taxes come flooding in from elsewhere that they hadn't been anticipating. One irony, of course, that is probably the announcement that Iain Duncan Smith himself would dearly have loved to make. He might have had to resign to do it, but it seems he has got his way.
All right, Laura, thank you very much.